Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you at the end of March. And to everyone out there, I have to apologize, because in my last episode, I repeatedly said that Godzilla vs. Kong would be released on March 26th. I'm very incorrect on that. It will be released March 31st. So I am sorry about that one, but if you've had King Kong or Godzilla fever, it seems that classic movie channels are replaying the old ones. And Godzilla vs. Kong will be available in both theaters and streaming on HBO Max starting March 31st. So again, I do apologize for misleading you, but I will make it up to you in some way. And the first way I will attempt to make it up to you is by talking about a couple interesting new releases. The first one will be 6 Minutes to Midnight, the historical drama about Nazi families that send their children abroad just before the war. Then I will be talking about the new horror film, The Toll. And the final film I will be talking about is the indie film, A Week Away, about a teenager that has a run-in with the law, but finds solace in his female companion. And in my final segment, I'm going to be taking a deeper dive into the profile of Herman J Menkowitz. He is the screenwriter of Citizen Kane and the person that the Oscar-nominated film Mank was made about. So when a film made about your life is nominated for 10 Academy Awards, it gets me wondering just who you were. So I will be taking a look at his life, and hopefully that'll inspire some of you to check out the film Mank. But before we get into all that, it of course is time to take a look at the book 1001 Movies Before You Die, and pick one that I recommend you see before you die this week. Not to say that you're going to die this week, just that this week, the film I'm talking about from the book should be the one that you watch. Sorry to anyone I freaked out by implying you will die this week. I'm sure you all live very healthy lives to see just how ridiculous humanity becomes in the future, so don't worry. But when it comes to the movie I'm recommending you see this week, it is Ferris Bueller's Day Off, mainly for the tagline, "Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it." And I think with the past year, that's an incredibly poignant message, and hopefully over the past year, people have realized what's really important in life and which monotonous conventions that we have in life can be de-emphasized. Now, this film is extremely popular, so I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, but to give you a quick synopsis, main character, played by Matthew Broderick, fakes that he is sick so he can get out of school. He then embarks on an epic day off, traveling around the city of Chicago and living life to the fullest. Written and directed by John Hughes, this was very in keeping with his other films of the time, of Adolescence Rebellion, and it's really just a masterclass in cynical comedy. And while this movie is very much a product of its time, the mid-80s, it still holds up today, and really people of any generation can relate to it. So to anyone who has not seen it, I definitely recommend you check it out. And it is replayed on TV very often, but if you just can't wait to see it, you can watch it on YouTube and Amazon Prime Video for the very reasonable price of $2.99. So there you have it, this week's recommendation from the book of 1001 Movies to See Before You Die, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But the first piece of new cinema I'm going to be focusing on is the new film 6 Minutes to Midnight. And I understand there's a perpetual love affair with World War II. It's just such a compelling real-life story from so many angles, but really feels like there's a ton of movies coming out about it right now. I mean, last episode I talked about The Good Traitor, and even the film I talked about, The Courier, had a little bit of World War II aspects to it, and especially last year with Jojo Rabbit, the Tom Hanks film Greyhound, it really just seems World War II is getting this renaissance of films made about it, and I wonder what the cause of that is. But back to the film at hand, it is 6 Minutes to Midnight, and it is based on true events, as most movies seem to be nowadays. But the premise revolves around the Nazi high command officers sending their daughters abroad to a finishing school in England, and one of the teachers at this school has mysteriously turned up dead on a beach. Those Nazis, wherever they seem to go, trouble seems to follow. But for those of you unfamiliar with the British education system, they are more concerned with things carrying on business as usual than they are actually looking into something like the murder of one of their teachers. So, the main character is the replacement for this teacher that has turned up dead, and his main mission is to uncover what happened. And again, this movie is titled 6 Minutes to Midnight, mainly because at this time, the world is well aware of what Hitler is doing, and he has annexed certain countries, but this film is set directly before his invasion of Poland. So right off the bat, this film has a lot of really compelling elements to it. It's a murder mystery where the main character is trying to uncover how his predecessor died. It's a suspense thriller because you're unaware of what characters at this school are trustworthy and which ones are engaging in a cover-up, or who has ulterior motives. And with it being set directly prior to the main inciting incident of World War II, there's a ticking clock element to all of this. So the plot of the film itself is very compelling, and it's sort of crazy to think that this is based off true events. Now this, of course, there was artistic license taken with this story, but this school did exist. Hitler was trying to have his officers send their children to England in order to make social relationships with the English elite, and especially prior to the invasion of Poland, there were people in countries around Europe that were sympathetic to Hitler's cause. And thus we have a school like this one where they're sympathetic to the Nazi cause and accepting the children of high-ranking Nazi officials. Now, while the plot to this movie is incredibly fascinating, one fascinating aspect of it is the fact that it is made by Eddie Izzard. He stars in it and also co-wrote the script, so it's pretty ironic that a gender-fluid British comedian is making a film about Nazism in general. And in an interview with NPR, Izzard said that he hopes Hitler is revolving somewhere in a ditch, which I would say is a pretty good way to piss on the grave and spit in the face of him and his master race agenda. So good for Eddie Izzard. But Izzard is not the only talented actor in this film. Academy Award winner Judi Dench is in the film as well as a type of headmistress type figure, as well as Academy Award winner Jim Broadbent is in the film. So there's no shortage of talent in the cast. And it is definitely needed to tell a story that is this layered and this complex with so many opposing character dynamics and subplots going on in the background. In a film like 6 Minutes to Midnight, the acting is really what's going to carry this film and bring the entertainment value. And just what a crazy concept that this film is based off of. I mean, this school is real, and there were, without a doubt, Nazi officials that were sending their daughters to this school. I'm sure for multiple reasons, to keep them away from Germany as it was about to begin engaging in the war effort, as well as possibly making political allies before Hitler and Germany really revealed to the world what they were. Because, as we all know, the Nazi propaganda machine was incredible at manipulating the facts and spinning their intentions to make it sound like they were something other than they actually were. And I'm sure that themes of that nature are going to be incorporated into this film, where a situation appears to be one thing, but when you dig a little deeper and find out a little bit more about the intentions that a character has, there will be a severe manipulation of the facts going on. And I feel as though that'll be pretty accurate to the time period where this film was set, given that communication was a lot slower and there wasn't as much fact-checking back then. So if you hear one thing about how Hitler is a benevolent ruler who's really just looking to unite the countries of Europe, there were definitely people more apt to believe that back in the day. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we obviously understand what he was actually up to and the type of dictator that he was. But at the time that 6 Minutes to Midnight is set, it's easy to see why he had people that were sympathetic to his cause. One thing that we do have to keep in mind that during this time period, the world was still rather imperialistic. The idea that you could seize a country through military means was widely accepted as kind of just the way of the world. And I think above all else, the main value that 6 Minutes to Midnight is going to provide is that mindset of what it was like at the time. Again, this film takes place in Great Britain just before World War II is fully declared, and getting the perspective of people that history remembers as being on the right side of history, the British, and really challenging that narrative that things were truly that black and white. The school that this entire film was based off of, the Augusta Victorian College for Girls, on their crest, it had the Nazi swastika right next to the Great Britain flag. Now, of course, the British would go on to oppose the Germans in World War II with the election of Winston Churchill in 1940, but just the mere fact that there was this school that was essentially made so that Great Britain and Germany had a friendly relationship prior to the war just goes to show that things weren't so black and white, and it wasn't that Hitler was rising to power solely by generating support in his own nation of Germany. He had allies in places like England, even in France before they were invaded. And a film like this really just goes to show that a movement like the Nazi war machine isn't built overnight, and it doesn't begin moving without support from other countries. So seeing all the conflicts in this film play out related to what was going on as it relates to the war will be compelling to see, as well as how it's encapsulated in Eddie Izzard's character, who is someone that is half English and half German. So with Eddie Izzard playing a character that has literal foots in both camps, we'll get an on-screen personification of the internal struggle between the different leanings that people had at the time. Germany had been engaging in military conflicts prior to this, but the main thing that's going to set off World War II is the invasion of Poland, because France and England guaranteed the integrity of Poland's borders in March of 1939, and once they're invaded, whatever leanings certain people had in Great Britain, they were forced to declare war on Germany, thus kicking off World War II. And this story of a school with a bunch of daughters of high-ranking Nazi officials essentially on enemy soil after Germany invades Poland, it's going to be really interesting to see what the dynamic is once that event happens in the film. Again, there isn't a lot of information given on what characters' motivations are, and once war is declared, having essentially a school full of war prisoners, how is that conflict going to be resolved? Are the teachers at the school going to show compassion? Are they going to essentially arrest the students? Or will there be a plot twist out of left field that nobody sees coming? Because while this film is based on true events and this school did exist, the actual story being played out on screen is fabricated. So it's not like there's a historical record of what happened at the Augusta Victorian College. So this story, in the confines of what happens at the school after Germany invades Poland, could really go in any direction. So not only will 6 Minutes Until Midnight be illuminating from a historical perspective, but it will also provide suspense throughout, given that there's no definitive record of these people or what happened during this time period, which all in all, I guess, is the main appeal of historical fiction. But once again, the film is 6 Minutes to Midnight. It stars Eddie Izzard, Judi Dench, and Jim Broadbent. The film takes place directly before Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, and is set at a school that many high-ranking German officials would send their daughter to for college, with many compelling elements, including a murder mystery whodunit, the main character trying to find out who he can trust, as well as the ticking clock up until the start of World War II. So for all of you interested in checking it out, the film will be available Friday, March 26th, and will be accessible via video on demand. So be sure to check out 6 Minutes to Midnight. Right now, however, we are going to take a break on the GSMC Movie Podcast. But be sure to stick around, as coming up, I'm going to be talking about the new horror film Toll, which tells the story about a woman who takes a cab to her father's country home, but unfortunately the driver takes a wrong turn. And eventually the car stalls on a remote stretch of road, and the main characters encounter an unseen presence. So once again, a lot of horror films are coming out this spring because they were delayed from being released around Halloween. But when we come back from break, we will have some fun with it, and be sure to stick around until the end of the show, where we're going to be diving into the profile of Herman J Menkowitz. He is the real-life screenwriter that the Academy Award-nominated film Mank was based off of. And I have had this idea of profiling different filmmakers, actors, so with his movie being nominated for 10 Academy Awards, it seems as good a place as any to start with him. So be sure to stick around, as we'll be engaging in the life and times of Herman J Menkowitz. So don't go anywhere. The GSMC Movie Podcast will be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just concluded talking about the new film, 6 Minutes to Midnight, which details a finishing school in Europe that was a real place, and it was a place where high-ranking Nazi officials would send their daughters to be educated, and this film is set directly before the beginning of World War II. So there are many compelling plot points going on in this film. What are the teachers at a British school going to do with the daughters of Nazi officers once their country has declared war on Germany? There is also a murder mystery aspect to this film, as the main character is looking to find out what happened to his predecessor, who turned up on the beach dead, all with the ticking clock leading up to the invasion of Poland. The film stars Eddie Izzard, Judi Dench, and Jim Broadbent. So for those of you interested in learning about this story based on true events, you can check it out via video on demand. But shifting gears to our next film, which is also a suspense thriller with more of a horror aspect to it, I will be talking about the movie The Toll. From my initial impressions of this movie, it kind of seems like the Blair Witch Project meets Slender Man. And to give a brief synopsis of the film, there's this woman who catches an Uber at the airport, and she needs to go a very long distance to reach her father's country home. Unfortunately, her driver takes a wrong turn, and they end up in this very remote area where apparently they have entered into a different realm. But luckily for them and us as an audience, there is a woman who has all the information they need and can explain what is happening, and that they have entered into a realm where there is an entity known as the Toll Man, and you cannot leave until you have paid his toll. So I will give the film, it has an interesting premise, even though the exposition is pretty much spoon-fed to the audience. That being said, one of the best things about horror films isn't really the who or the why. It's really just about the suspenseful ride the audience is taken on, and how the filmmakers are able to elicit fear. And while the actors in it aren't household names, a lot of today's megastars got their start in crazy horror films. Jennifer Aniston was in the ridiculous film The Leprechaun, which was her first film role, and Johnny Depp made his film debut in Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, where he is eaten by a bed. So from an acting standpoint, it's very beneficial to be in a horror film. You're able to demonstrate a wide range of emotion and tap into some really powerful acting that wouldn't be seen in a traditional style movie. But when it comes to the cast in this movie, the star of the film is Jordan Hayes, who plays Cammy. She is the passenger who is exhausted after flying in order to visit her father. She has been in a couple things, but could be one of these people that gets a major bump from appearing in a horror film. She is probably best known for her role on the series Helix, where she played Dr. Sarah Jordan. So not taking anything away from her acting ability, but hopefully this film does a lot to propel her into mainstream success. Because one thing about the horror genre in particular, no matter how big or how small the budget is, there is always an audience for these type of movies. And one of the best things for someone like Jordan Hayes in this film, she's going to be one of only a few characters, so she's going to be guaranteed a ton of screen time. And with that, she will have plenty of opportunities to show off her acting ability. Now, the other main character she will be sharing the spotlight in this film with is going to be Max Toplin, who plays Spencer, the Uber driver who is taking her to her father's house, but for some reason, his phone malfunctions and he ends up taking the worst wrong turn of his life. Much like Hayes, Toplin does not have that many credits to his name. He is probably best known for a reoccurring role he had on the series Suits, where he played Harold Gunderson, but he is also serving as one of the film's producers. And one of the main benefits of being one of the producers, you can cast yourself in one of the leading roles where you are guaranteed an incredible amount of screen time. So while it is hard to imagine him becoming the next Johnny Depp, I am sure that both he and Hayes will benefit greatly from playing the leads in this film. And this film is done on a pretty small scale from its limited cast, and almost the entirety of the film taking place in the woods. But again, one thing about the horror genre is you can have a tremendous impact as a film on a very limited budget. For instance, projects like the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity set records for how much money they made in relation to how much they had as a budget. Now, any movie that's coming out right now is having challenges when it comes to making back its budget, but the concept of having a tremendous effect with modest means doesn't just relate to a film's budget. The whole idea of less is more, especially when it comes to horror films, can oftentimes enhance the film. The Toll Man in this film is essentially going to be an entity that is pretty unseen throughout the film. And the concept of not seeing the monster can often be more frightening than it being front and center. Take Steven Spielberg's Jaws as an example. Due to technical difficulties with the shark where it would break down in the water, and not wanting to blow a bunch of the movie's budget on it constantly being repaired, Spielberg made the choice to show the shark sparingly. And in that film, with the shark not being seen, it's much more ominous because the shark could be anywhere, and it could have the ability to strike at any point, so it's creating this idea of suspense. And probably the biggest component of fear is not knowing what's going to happen. So in Jaws, that was manifested by the shark being in the water without any clear visuals on it. And in this film, The Toll, it's going to be, I'm not really sure what to call him, but we'll call him the Toll Man, being in the pitch black woods without anybody able to see him. So I imagine this film will be centered around a lot of suspenseful build-ups, leading to a bunch of dramatic reveals. And it will be interesting to see what the director, Michael Nader, does with this film. And taking a look at this film really just has me curious as to what the big draw to horror films are, because there's clearly a market for it. And I have read a ton of articles about people saying that if you're looking to get into filmmaking, you should go into the horror genre because there are such ready-made audiences for those films. And you don't need major stars, you don't need a bunch of marketing, you don't need a big cinematic interconnected universe. People are just naturally drawn to horror films. And I found this article that pretty much explains why. Audiences are drawn to horror films for three main reasons. According to a study published in the Journal of Media Psychology, audiences go see horror films for the purposes of tension, relevance, and unrealism. The first of these being tension. Some people go see a horror film for the sheer mystery and shock value it can provide. In this movie, The Toll, the mystery is going to be, who is this mysterious entity? What does he want? What is the toll that is going to have to be paid for the main characters to escape? So some audience members solely go to see the mystery be resolved, and for that moment at the end when all is revealed. And the second prevailing reason people go to horror films is relevance. For some people, people want to see a horror film with elements that relate to their actual lives. I really don't see the appeal of that element, or why someone would go to a film that has components of their actual life in them where you could be put into a terrifying situation, but that is human psychology for you. And this film, The Toll, has plenty of elements of that. Almost everyone's been in either an Uber or a Lyft, and the idea of the driver making a wrong turn and ending up in a place with no reception, especially at night where you don't know where you are, is a pretty terrifying concept that pretty much everyone can relate to. So if you seek out horror films for the reason of relevance, The Toll has you covered with the main concept of a ride gone wrong. But if you are a person that goes to horror films for the third reason, which is the unrealism, The Toll will also have elements of that, given that the ride has crossed over into what is described to be a different realm, which operates under different rules than the normal world, and it is controlled by, again, let's call him the Toll Man, who is referred to more of as an entity as opposed to a human being. So if you enjoy horror films for the unrealism, The Toll has you covered on that front as well. But there are other reasons that people enjoy going to see horror films. For instance, people that really enjoy the genre were reported to really enjoy feeling intense emotions. So it really doesn't matter what emotion they're feeling, they just like it to be intense. I guess that can also explain the type of people that are always seeking out conflict. They just have this compulsion to seek out intense emotions because on some level it gives them pleasure. And when watching a horror film, your entire body is stimulated. Your brain is stimulated, your heart starts racing. Your body is essentially going into the fight or flight response. And there must be this just deep-seated psychological need for people to seek that response. And building off of the emotions and psychological effects that a horror film triggers in the body, it has also been proven to be quite beneficial to people with anxiety because the experience the body goes through after seeing a horror film, where the brain is easing itself out of that place of fear, which is called the rest and digest experience, because once the body has removed itself from that fear-inducing environment, the brain does produce elevated levels of dopamine. And apparently it is healthy to go into a situation that is quote-unquote risky or scary and come out okay. So it is strange to think of the effects that horror films can have on people. And one more thing that horror films seem to do to people is help bond them with the people that they are around. I don't know if that's some sort of us versus the world mentality, or if it's just the whole strength in numbers thing. But there is something to watching horror films as a group that does help you bond. And to take that another step further, it can actually increase the level of attraction you have to a person. So the old stereotype of bringing a date to a horror film will help you get some action actually is rooted in psychological principles. Mostly because when you are watching a horror film, your body is in a state of vulnerability. And when you are in that state of vulnerability with another person, it creates a level of intimacy. So logically it makes sense, but it is really just crazy to think all these effects that horror films have on audiences, and the varied reasons that audiences keep turning out to see them. So, if you are going to go to a horror film to see the mystery solved, or you want to see elements of things that relate to your own life on screen, or if you're going for the sheer unrealistic nature of the film, Or maybe you're one of these people that wants to, on some level, experience these deep psychological emotions that are evoked from a horror film, whether that be you derive pleasure from experiencing intense emotions, or you want the dopamine rush after leaving the film when your body is coming out of the fight or flight response, or maybe you want to see the film with someone you're hoping to achieve a higher level of intimacy with. Whatever your reason is for checking out a horror film, I highly recommend you check out The Toll. It is already available, having debuted Friday, March 26th, and you can stream it via video on demand. So whatever the reason is that draws you to horror films, be sure to check out The Toll. I, however, am going to be taking a quick break, but be sure to stick around because coming up, we're going to have another segment where I update you on news of the industry, including who's been cast in what projects are being greenlit or delayed, as well as a box office report to see which films are making back some money. I will also be talking about the film A Week Away. And for those of you listening, I do have to warn you, this film completely tricked me as to what it was. When I decided to feature it on the podcast, I thought it was going to be a film about a troubled youth and his story of repentance. It turns out it is a very Christian-themed musical. And while this film is not my cup of tea, and I did not make it through the entire thing, I do want to be introducing diverse content onto this podcast, so we're going to talk about A Week Away. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as we are going to be profiling Herman J Menkowitz, the Hollywood screenwriter who had the film Mank made about him. The film is currently nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and when a film about your life reaches that level of notoriety, it gets me wondering about who you are. And as it turns out, he was a pretty charismatic character. He battled alcoholism for most of his life, but that didn't stop him from becoming one of the premier screenwriters in all of Hollywood, making contributions to such films as The Wizard of Oz, as well as Citizen Kane. And not only was he a credit to the industry during his time, seemingly his entire family would make contributions to the film industry. So if you are curious about the man whose film is now nominated for 10 Academy Awards, be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as we'll be talking about Herman J Menkowitz. So do not go anywhere, because the GSMC Movie Podcast will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the new horror film, The Toll. The film about an Uber driver and their passenger that take a wrong turn into what is essentially another realm, and they are plagued by an unseen enemy. So if you are a fan of the horror genre, this film has a little bit of everything for you. It was released Friday, March 26th, and it is available via video on demand, so be sure to check it out. The next film I will be talking about is the new Netflix original, A Week Away. And coming up later on the show, I will be doing a profile on Herman J Menkowitz, the person that the new film Mank was based on. So be sure to stick around until the end of the show for that. But right now, I do want to give a quick update on some things happening in the industry. Starting off with a box office report. Domestically, Bob Odenkirk's Nobody debuted at number 1, raking in $6.7 million, while Raya and the Last Dragon came in second, making $3.5 million. Tom and Jerry is still in theaters, and it raked in $2.5 million, while Chaos Walking raked in $1.2, and rounding out the top 5, The Courier made an even million, but these numbers all pale in comparison to Godzilla vs. Kong, which, while it is still yet to debut in the US, as it will come out March 31st, it has debuted internationally, and it made an astonishing $122 million. That's respectable regardless of if there's a pandemic going on, and that's got to be an encouraging sign for theaters here in the US. And it just goes to show you, audiences aren't complicated. Give them giant monsters fighting it out, and they will come. But in terms of new announcements, The Rock hijacked Times Square to tell everyone that his film Black Adam will be premiering in 2022. Specifically July 29th, and this has been a much anticipated film ever since he was announced as the popular DC character, but due to him being the most in-demand actor in the business, it is tough to work around his schedule. So I'm sure that fans are happy that movie is finally being made. And one thing that may divide movie fans is the announcement that Comic-Con is attempting to hold an in-person event Thanksgiving weekend. This has been met with a lot of criticism, given that Thanksgiving weekend is one of the biggest travel times of the year. And again, who knows where we'll be with the whole COVID-19 thing. So having a massive assembly of people may not be the best thing, but at this point, I have no problem with companies or industries being optimistic and making plans that will get things back to normal. So that is probably the most notable news I can give you at this point regarding the film industry. I know that I still owe everybody a name to this segment. I'm looking for ones that aren't copyrighted, so I'm not stealing from other people. So for now, we'll just call it the GSMC Movie News segment. And to anyone out there who would like to provide us with a sponsorship to that segment, feel free to contact me. But moving on to my shameless self-promotion, let's get into the film I wanted to talk about a week away. And when I decided to talk about this film on the podcast, I had only read the description. And this film was described to me as a person that was in trouble with the law. He had a choice between going to juvie or going to a camp that will help rehabilitate him, where he finds a female companion that will help him with his redemption. So I was under the impression this will be a charmy indie darling that will pluck at the heartstrings and will have a real message to tell. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have a message to tell or that it is not an entertaining film that some people may enjoy. But from what I saw, I was very misguided on my initial impressions of the film. And while I thought this could be a film that could really appeal to all audiences for some reason, I have a feeling that there is really only one target demographic that this film is aimed at, and that would be teenage girls. Which I am not knocking. There need to be films for all kinds of audiences, but to give people an idea of the journey I embarked on when watching the film, I will give you a description of the opening of the film, because so often I am talking about new releases that I don't get the chance to see before talking about them on the podcast. So for this one, it was out on Netflix, so I figured why not take a look. To begin with the opening credits, it's like a sequence out in Napoleon Dynamite on LSD. It is a bunch of stop-motion animation of inanimate objects moving around the screen while the cast and crew's names are displayed. So right off the bat, I'm like, okay, this is going to be a quirky indie film. It looks like it should have been made about 15 years ago, but let's check it out. After that, we get to the opening scene, which involves a teenager with a guitar running from a police officer, and there's some throwaway dialogue about him stealing a car, so I guess that's what he's done wrong. But with this opening scene, I'm like, okay, right off the bat, there's some conflict. Doesn't matter what's going on, this kid has committed a crime, and already he's facing repercussions for those actions, so here we are, already off to the races with this film. But inevitably, because he is weighed down by a guitar and another bag, the cop catches up with him and apprehends him. This leads to him being taken to the police station, and for some reason, the criminal justice system in this movie operates under the notion that you can either go to juvie or you can go to Christian summer camp. Under the impression that this is the lesser of two evils, the main character, Will, decides to go to Christian summer camp. And while he is on the bus ride to this Christian summer camp, he is indoctrinated into the way that they do things. And this is the point of the movie where I am completely lost. Because, like I said, I thought this film was going to be a plucky indie film with a little bit of grit to it. And boy, oh boy, was I mistaken. So, on this bus ride to the Christian camp, the entire bus bursts into song. And this song is about the people on the bus finding their place in the world, in addition to making a bunch of memories at this camp. So, at this point in the film, the main character, Will, is not participating in the spontaneous songs. So, I think, hey, maybe there's going to be this aspect to it where it is sort of a satire on the whole teenage music movie where he's just going to be there observing what's going on. And I was reassured by this because once they got off the bus, guess what happens again? They break into song spontaneously, once again singing about how they're going to find their place in the world and how they're going to make a bunch of tremendous memories at camp. Now, I have been to a ton of camps in my time. I worked as a camp counselor for 5 years. At absolutely no point was there ever a time when people would spontaneously burst into song. And if there were a group of campers singing, the choreography was nothing compared to what was in this film. But we are about 10 minutes into this film. There have been 2 instances of the cast spontaneously breaking into song. And up until this point, the main character has not joined in, so I think that's going to be a running joke throughout the entire movie. But boy, was I wrong. After one scene of strictly dialogue where one character gets to know another, we go right back into choreographed yet spontaneous musical numbers. And this time the main character is involved. So he's clearly up to speed with how things are gonna work in this film. So the rough teen that had a choice between going to juvie and picking Christian camp is already leading his fellow campers in elaborate musical numbers. So I have to be honest, at this point in the film, I really don't know why I'm still watching it. But the scene that follows the third musical number that has occurred about 15 minutes into the film is what made me check out entirely. Because apparently since Harry Potter came out, there cannot be a film about young people without them being sorted into different groups that have the colors green, red, yellow, and blue associated with them. So that scene, in addition to finally realizing that this was essentially a clone of High School Musical, made me check out of the film. Now, of course, I am way outside the target demographic of this film, which I can only assume is aimed towards teenage girls and big fans of musical theater, but the sheer ridiculousness just couldn't keep me interested. But that is okay. If you're a fan of campy films that have a bunch of pop hits attached to it, in addition to a bunch of elaborate musical numbers, A Week Away may be the film for you. It is definitely a quirky film that is not meant to be taken too seriously, and I could really see the appeal for teenagers that are going through that phase of life where you're unsure of yourself, you're discovering new aspects of your personality, and you are seeking a source of belonging. I just have to say, my main problem with the film is they bill the main character as this hardened criminal, like he's some sort of teenage Scarface, and within 15 minutes he is leading the foray when it comes to all the singing and all the dancing. But even though he has fully embraced the way things are done at this camp, within the first 15 minutes of the film, the authority figures still see him as a problem, and he's going to have to be monitored. And again, this movie is not for people like me. It is made for children. And movies of this specific nature, where they're really out to sell songs more so than the film itself. I'm sure that the plot was secondary when they were coming up with this film, but we have a saying on this podcast, just because it's made for children doesn't mean it can suck. But in fairness, I have completely no idea if the rest of this film is bad. I did check out, but I encourage you to check out the entire film and let me know what happens. I'm sure that there are elements of this film that are good, but personally I grew up during the High School Musical era, and after a certain point it really just became a major fatigue with not only those movies but those songs being everywhere, and this film really just seems like a carbon copy of that, and I will be absolutely astounded if there is not a second one of these made. But before we get to that point, I guess I should give you the main cast of this film. The incredible David Koechner plays one of the administrators of the camp, and he was one of the main reasons I was able to stay invested in the film for the short amount of time that I did. No matter what he's in, he does a terrific job, whether it is in the Anchorman films or his role of Todd Packer on The Office. He has this tremendous comedic presence, and he becomes some sort of a father figure for the main character. Also playing one of the administrators is Sherry Shepherd, who most people will probably know from 30 Rock, where she played Angie Jordan, the wife of Tracy Morgan's character. She also has incredible comedic timing. And after those two, we have a slew of child stars that are hoping to make a name for themselves in this film. In the lead role of Will Hawkins, we have Kevin Quinn, who just gives off the vibe of one of these Disney test tube babies, having played Xander McCormick in the Disney Channel original series Bunked. And if I had to guess, this film is trying to make him into the Zac Efron type character. Another actor in this film, seemingly grown in the lab of the House of Mouse, is Bailey Madison, who has appeared on the Disney Channel original show The Wizards of Waverly Place. And to her credit, she has a lot of film roles under her belt where she's played a kid. She was in the Tobey Maguire, Jake Gyllenhaal drama Brothers, as well as the Adam Sandler comedy Just Go With It. So even at the young age of 21, she has a great deal of experience. Conversely, however, someone who will be making their film debut in A Week Away is Gabriel Cook, and he will be playing George. I would like to tell you more about him, but there is really not that much information about him. I can tell you he has a crush on the character that is played by the next actor in the main film, and that would be Kat Connor Sterling, who plays Presley. She does have a few credits under her belt. Probably most notable is the appearance she had on Fox's 911. But as with all child actors, hopefully this is the movie that helps propel her career to new heights. So, for all those interested in checking out A Week Later, it is available on Netflix, and again, my critiques of the film aside, it does seem like a film that is really intending to entertain and deliver a rather wholesome message. But that's all I'll say about the film A Week Away. Once again, if you are interested, you can check it out on Netflix. But right now on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we're going to take a quick break. But be sure to stick around as we're going to be diving in and profiling Herman J Menkowitz, the prolific screenwriter that the Academy Award-nominated film Mank is based off of. He was a pretty interesting character from his days working in the newspaper industry to his military service, all the way up to his contributions on films such as The Wizard of Oz and Citizen Kane. And when a film made about your life is nominated for 10 Academy Awards, you are probably an individual worth checking out. So do not go anywhere, because that's what we will be diving into when we get back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the film A Week Away, the film that really tricked me from being an independent film about a teenager in trouble with the law and searching for redemption to being essentially a high school musical installment. The film is now available on Netflix, so anybody looking to check it out, especially if you have a family and anyone interested in musical theater, would definitely enjoy this film. So the film is A Week Away, and once again, you can find it on Netflix. But moving on to our final topic of the day, that will be Herman J Menkowitz, the screenwriter that inspired the film Mank, which is now nominated for 10 Academy Awards. So when a movie featuring you and your life story garners so much critical praise, I'm kind of curious as to who you were. And from my research, he's a pretty interesting dude, and he had a pretty expansive family that touched on a lot of different areas. So the Mankowitzes were a bit like fruit flies. They multiplied like heck and managed to get into everywhere. But before we get into the lives of any of the others, let's start with the man himself, Herman J Menkowitz. To give a quick bio, he was born in New York City in 1897 to German Jewish immigrants Franz and Johanna Mankiewicz, and the family would eventually move to Pennsylvania, where his father Franz accepted a teaching position. Growing up, he was described as bookish and often fell short of his father's expectations, so he had a couple demons to fight growing up. But later the family would move back to New York City, and he would become a graduate of Columbia University, where he was the editor of the Columbia Spectre, which was the student-run newspaper at the time. He would go on to work for a couple newspapers, including the American Jewish Chronicle and the New York Tribune, before enlisting in the armed services. During his time in the armed forces, he would rise to the position of director of the American Red Cross News Service, so he was able to keep up his habit of reporting the news. And during his time spent as a war correspondent, he would write pieces for the New York Times. And when he finally returned home, he would work for the New York World, while contributing to other news outlets such as Vanity Fair and the Saturday Evening Post. And this is when he really gained the reputation of being a very skilled and prodigious writer. And this was the point he began writing creatively, where he would develop plays such as The Good Fellows and The Wild Man of Borneo. So he is beginning to gain experience in the entertainment industry while still working as a news correspondent. Because during the same time, he would work as the theater critic for the New York Times, and then he would be the exclusive theater critic of the New Yorker. So he was really racking up quite the resume, which would eventually lead to him being offered a contract with Paramount and him moving to Los Angeles in 1926. And by the end of 1927, he was in charge of the scenario department and was in charge of writer recruitment for Paramount. So very soon into his association with Paramount, he was gaining tremendous influence. And while a lot of the films that he worked on have kind of fallen into obscurity, the real impressive thing about him was just his unrelenting work ethic. Between 1928 and 1929, he was working on 25 different films, and this was including writing the scripts, which led to him becoming one of the highest paid writers in the world, just as The film industry was embracing sound. So he was at the height of his profession when the industry was changing to better exemplify his talents. And one pretty crazy thing about him is when he was working on films, he would often receive no credit for them. He would really just work on them to help out people that he knew and for the sheer love of the craft. So he was gaining a reputation as someone who was really just invested and had a love affair with the film industry. But he was also drawing controversy at this time, given that he was writing a screenplay, The Mad Dog of Europe, which was based off of Hitler's rise to power. And it got to the point where Joseph Goebbels, the head of education and propaganda, very interesting how someone can hold both those distinctions. But he would inform studios that any Herman J Menkowitz picture would not be shown in Nazi Germany unless his credit was removed from the film. So Menkowitz really became one of the early voices who stood up and spoke against Hitler in Europe, and he would go on to care for refugees that were fleeing Nazi Germany during the time. So not only was he an incredible screenwriter and at the top of his profession, he was a tremendous humanitarian. But by this time, in the 30s, he was widely regarded as one of the best screenwriters in the world, and this led to him getting part of the project, The Wizard of Oz. When the studio was adapting the book, they decided to use 10 screenwriters, and Mankiewicz was tasked with writing the opening, which would later become known as the Kansas sequence. And while that portion of the book was very short, Mankiewicz really felt the need that the audience had to really connect with the character of Dorothy and get a better sense of her background before they were thrust into the mystical world of Oz. And he was also the one that instructed that the Kansas sequence be filmed in black and white, so as to contrast it even more so with the fantastically bright and colored world of Oz. So he really just had this innate ability to make movies and make decisions that would enhance them. And as everybody knows, The Wizard of Oz is one of the most classic films of all time and is still beloved to this day. So you can thank Mankiewicz for helping bring that story to the big screen. But once again, he was not credited with writing the screenplay for The Wizard of Oz. And it's unclear if this was politically motivated, where the other screenwriters wanted credit for it, or if it was just another case of him simply wanting to contribute to an incredible film. But despite not receiving credit at the time for his contributions to The Wizard of Oz, soon he would go on to have the ultimate achievement of his career, and that would be when he worked with Orson Welles to co-write the screenplay to Citizen Kane, for which he won an Academy Award, and this period of his life is what the new Academy Award-nominated film Mank is based on. Now, there is a lot of controversy around the screenplay to Citizen Kane over who's more responsible for it, Orson Welles or Herman J Menkowitz, and with most stories, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So I'm just going to say, because they both received Academy Awards for the screenplay, I'm going to say they both wrote it, but the controversy stems from Orson Welles saying that he was the sole writer of it. And with these events happening 80 years ago, it's pretty hard to find a definitive conclusion as to what the real truth of the matter is. But my 2 cents on the matter is the movie Citizen Kane is about a newspaperman, and Herman J Menkowitz had a vast background in the newspaper industry. So while it's pretty well established that Kane was based off of mogul William Randolph Hearst, there are aspects to that movie that I'm sure only someone who worked in the newspaper industry could bring to those scenes. And not to take anything away from either of them, Orson Welles was an incredible director and did things with a camera that had been unheard of at the time, and the film itself is still regarded as one of, if not the greatest film ever made. Which really just begs the question, what was the Academy thinking that year when they did not vote it as Best Picture and gave the award to How Green Was My Valley? I've heard of the film, but I'm a movie nerd who has a film podcast. I doubt that anyone under the age of 70 has even heard of it. But back to Citizen Kane and the controversy surrounding the writing of it. It really isn't hard to see how Orson Welles was pretty much just given the credit for writing the screenplay as well. He was also the star of the film and the director. And at the time, He was only 25 and erupting onto the film industry and was just branded this wonderkin. So people in the industry and the public were just having this love affair with Orson Welles. And to this day, Citizen Kane is what he is most synonymous with. It would go on to define his career and would be his Mona Lisa. So it's not hard to see why a 25-year-old who's being told that you're the greatest thing in the industry would let his ego get the better of him and really just become very possessive of Citizen Kane as a whole. And while it's not right to hoard all the credit for something that was clearly a collaborative process, it kind of is in keeping with who Herman J Menkowitz was. He was someone who would essentially work in the shadows and contribute to making incredible films without really receiving the credit that was owed to him. Thankfully, he did receive an Academy Award for Citizen Kane, so at least got that accolade. But it really just makes the real-life human being of Mankiewicz all that more intriguing, and really makes me want to know more about him. The film Mank is on the top of my watch list, and it's really ironic that the film about a man who really didn't receive a whole bunch of credit in his time is now being honored with 10 Academy Award nominations, and by sheer probability, the film is going to walk away with a couple of them. And once again, that film is Mank, which is now available on Netflix, and it's nominated for 10 Academy Awards this year. And this film focuses specifically on the time in Mankiewicz's life where he was writing the script for Citizen Kane. And just a little further proof that he, without a doubt, contributed to writing the script, with the main character being based off of William Randolph Hearst. Mankiewicz actually knew William Randolph Hearst. So in creating the character of Charles Foster Kane, there were clearly personality traits and mannerisms that he transferred into the script. Now, who was responsible for turning the script into the masterpiece it became? Who's to say, but there were clearly contributions from both Welles and Mankiewicz. But as with most creative endeavors, it was a collaborative process. It is without a doubt Orson Welles' masterpiece on so many levels, but by all accounts, he would not have been able to achieve it without the assistance of Mankiewicz. So, for both men, it goes on to be their most defining project of their careers. But unfortunately for Mankiewicz, he would not have much of a career beyond that. While he would contribute to producing other films following Citizen Kane, Mankiewicz also suffered from alcoholism. And in 1953, at the age of only 55, he died due to ureic poisoning. And while they had professional differences when it came to Citizen Kane, at his funeral, Orson Welles was quoted as saying, "He saw everything with clarity, no matter how odd or how right or how marvelous his point of view was. It was always diamond white, nothing muzzy." He left behind a legacy of being a brilliant filmmaker, and he left behind a legacy for his family to follow in his footsteps. Just to give you a brief synopsis of the sheer volume of talented writers and filmmakers from his family. His brother, Joseph L. Menkowitz, while not having the same reputation, probably achieved more success in terms of critical acclaim, having won 4 Academy Awards, including 2 for Best Director and 2 for Best Adapted Screenplay for his films A Letter to Three Wives and All About Eve, which set and still holds the record for most Academy Award nominations with 14. That has since been tied by Titanic and La La Land. But Joseph Menkowitz would go on to have tremendous success in the film industry. Herman's son, Don Mankiewicz, would go on to be nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay for the film I Want to Live. And his son, John, is still a producer, and he has been involved in projects such as House and House of Cards. Herman's other son, Frank Mankiewicz, would follow in his father's journalism footsteps, where he would ultimately become the press secretary for RFK's 1968 presidential campaign. And he was present at the infamous Ambassador Hotel assassination of the candidate. And his son, Joshua Mankiewicz, is a current NBC News correspondent, while his other son, Ben Mankiewicz, in addition to be a political commentator in his own right, is also the host of the Turner Classic Movie Channel. And then there is Tom Menkowitz, the son of Joseph and nephew of Herman, who contributed to writing films such as Superman the Movie, as well as being a creative consultant on several of the early James Bond films. So not only do we have to thank Herman J Menkowitz for his contributions to the film industry, really his entire family has and continues to contribute to the film and entertainment industry. So for anyone interested in seeing where it all began, I highly recommend you check out the film Mank, which is available on Netflix, or just do some independent research on the man himself, Herman J Menkowitz. He truly is a charismatic character that really had a reputation that proliferated the film industry. It is very unfortunate that his life was tragically cut short, and just goes to show you the effects personal demons can have over someone's life. But I hope you all have enjoyed this segment where we examine the profile of a classic Hollywood figure, and I hope to make it a reoccurring segment on the GSMC Movie Podcast. But that will do it for us today. Thank you again to everyone who is listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, which of course is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And if you have not already, I do encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so you're always notified when a new episode is out. And please be sure to write us a review. Those really help us a lot. And be sure to engage with us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The Twitter account is GSMC_movies, while the Instagram account is GSMC_movie. But that will do it for this episode. I've been your host, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.